A giant died so the world could live. Then a goddess built humans from mud. The story of Pangu and Nuwa, China's creation of heaven, earth, and humanity. Before there was sky. Before there was earth. Before there was light or dark, up or down. Before there was even the word before, there was an egg. Not a metaphor. Not a symbol. The oldest Chinese creation texts say it plainly. In the beginning, the entire universe was a single egg, floating in nothing, containing everything. And inside that egg, for 18,000 years, a giant slept. This is the story of Pangu, who broke the egg and split the world in two with his own body, and Nuwa, the goddess who came after him and knelt in the mud to build humanity with her own hands. It is one of the oldest stories in Chinese civilization, and it answers the two biggest questions any mythology ever has to answer. Where did the world come from, and where did we come from? The Chinese answer to both questions is the same. Someone gave their body. Someone gave their hands. The world was not spoken into being from a distance. It was built, physically, by someone who cared enough to bleed for it. Let us begin. The egg of chaos. Chinese cosmology does not begin with gods arguing in a void, or with a single divine word. It begins with something stranger and, in its own way, more scientific. It begins with Hundun, chaos. Not chaos as disorder or violence, but chaos as undifferentiated wholeness. A state where yin and yang, the two great opposing yet complementary forces of the universe, existed together, unseparated, mixed into one another like batter that hadn't yet been poured. The ancient text known as the Sanwu Liji, compiled by the scholar Su Zhang during the Three Kingdoms period, describes it directly. Before heaven and earth, the text says, all was chaos, shapeless and dark, like an egg. Within that egg, the principles of yin and yang were not yet divided. There was no light. There was no boundary. There was no shape, because shape requires two things to be different from each other, and in the egg, nothing was different from anything else. And inside this egg, something began to grow. Not from outside it. From within the chaos itself, condensing the way a pearl condenses inside an oyster, a being took form. He had no parents. He was not created by another god who came before him, because there was no other god. He simply emerged, the way a seed inside a fruit eventually becomes aware of being a seed. His name was Pangu. He grew inside that egg of chaos for 18,000 years. Try to imagine that span of time. 18,000 years is longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. It is longer than the time since the first cities were built, longer than the time since writing was invented, longer than the pyramids have stood, multiplied by 3. And for the entirety of that unimaginable stretch, Pangu slept curled in darkness inside a shell, growing larger, growing stronger, while outside his egg, the cosmos waited. Then he woke up. The splitting of heaven and earth. When Pangu woke, the first thing he felt was the wrongness of the dark. He was massive now, a giant beyond any human scale, his body grown to fill the egg completely, pressing against its shell on every side. He could not stretch. He could not breathe freely. The chaos that had nurtured him for 18,000 years had become a prison. So he did the only thing a being of his size and strength could do. He reached out. Some versions of the story say he had an axe, a great cosmic axe he had grown alongside, or that he simply swung his enormous arm, and he struck the shell of the egg with all his strength. The egg cracked. And what spilled out was not yolk or liquid. What spilled out was the entire material of the universe, suddenly given the chance to separate into the two things it had always secretly been: the light, clear, rising part, yang, and the heavy, turbid, sinking part, yin. The yang rose upward and became the sky. The yin sank downward and became the earth. In a single instant, after 18,000 years of fused stillness, heaven and earth were born, pulling apart from each other like two hands finally releasing a clasp they had held since before memory. But here is the detail that makes this myth different from almost every other creation story on Earth. Pangu did not simply make this happen and then disappear, content with his work. He was afraid the sky and earth would slip back together. He was afraid that without him, chaos would simply reassert itself, that yin and yang would collapse back into each other and undo everything he had just accomplished. So he stood between them. He planted his feet on the newly formed earth, and he pushed his head against the newly formed sky, and he held the two apart with his own body, like a pillar, like a column, like a man holding up the roof of a collapsing house with nothing but his own spine. And he stood like that for another 18,000 years. Every single day, the text says, heaven rose 10 feet, and earth sank 10 feet, and Pangu grew 10 feet taller to match them, never resting, never lowering his arms, holding the boundary between above and below with his own growing body for a second span of time longer than human history has yet lasted. He did not do this for glory. There was no one to witness it. There was no one to thank him. He held the sky up simply because if he stopped, the world he had just made possible would cease to exist before anyone ever had the chance to live in it. Eventually, the distance was great enough. Heaven was high. Earth was firm. The gap between them had become wide enough to hold steady on its own, the way a wall, once a certain height, no longer needs a hand pressed against it to keep from falling. And Pangu, after 36,000 years of existence, 18,000 sleeping, 18,000 standing, finally allowed himself to rest. He lay down, and he died. The body that became the world. This is the part of the story that separates Chinese cosmology from almost every other creation myth on Earth, and it is worth sitting with slowly. In most traditions, when a god finishes the work of creation, the god remains separate from what was created. The potter is not the clay. The architect is not the building. But in this story, when Pangu died, his body did not simply vanish or ascend to some other realm. His body became the world. The ancient texts describe this transformation in almost unbearable physical detail. His breath became the wind and the clouds. His voice became thunder. His left eye became the sun, and his right eye became the moon, which is why, some old commentators note, the sun and moon take turns governing the sky, day giving way to night the way one eye must close for the other to open. His 4 limbs and 5 extremities became the 5 great sacred mountains of China. His blood became the rivers. His muscles and veins became the fertile fields and the roads that crossed them. His flesh became the soil itself. His hair and his beard became the stars scattered across the night sky. His skin and the fine hairs upon it became the grass and the trees. His teeth and bones became the metals and stones buried in the earth. Even his sweat, the texts say, became the rain and the dew that falls on all of it. And in some versions of the story, the parasites and fleas that lived on Pangu's body, those small creatures that had clung to him through all those thousands of years, were transformed by the wind into human beings, scattering across the new earth to become the first people, born almost as an afterthought from the body of the giant who built the world they would inherit. Think about what this means. In Chinese cosmology, the mountains are not symbols of a god's power. They are a god's actual bones. The rivers are not blessed by divinity. They are divinity flowing. When you stand on solid ground in this mythology, you are standing on flesh that chose, 18,000 years into an impossible task, to keep holding the sky up rather than collapse, and then gave every remaining particle of itself so the world it had separated could continue to exist without him. There is no other being to thank for the ground beneath your feet. There is no creator watching from somewhere else. The creator became the floor. This is sacrifice in its purest, most literal form. Not a sacrifice of an animal on an altar to please a god. A sacrifice of the god himself, total and complete, with nothing held back, so that something other than himself could exist and continue. The loneliness of Nuwa. But a world made of mountains, rivers, sun, moon, and soil is still an empty world. The texts that follow Pangu's story introduce a different deity entirely, one with a different kind of power and a different kind of loneliness. Her name was Nuwa, and she is often depicted with the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a serpent or dragon, coiled and powerful, a being who existed in the world Pangu's body had built. She is sometimes called the Mother Goddess of China, sometimes the creator of mankind, and in some versions of the tradition, she existed even before Pangu, helping to repair the world rather than make it from nothing. But the story most often told, and the one most beloved across Chinese folklore, places her here, walking through the new earth, the mountains standing, the rivers running, the sun and moon trading the sky between them, and finding that for all its grandeur, the world was silent. There were animals. There were birds. There were fish in the rivers Pangu's blood had become. But there was no creature to look at the mountains and recognize them as beautiful. No creature to stand at the riverbank and wonder where the water came from. No creature capable of looking back at Nuwa and knowing that it was being looked at. She felt the absence of this acutely. The texts describe her wandering, dissatisfied, aware that something essential was missing from a world that otherwise had everything. So she knelt down at the edge of a riverbank, and she reached into the yellow mud, and she began to shape it with her own hands. She formed a small figure. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head, a face she modeled, the legends say, after her own reflection in the water, which is why human beings are said to resemble the gods, at least a little, at least in outline. And when she finished shaping it, she breathed life into it, or in some versions, simply set it down upon the earth, and it stood up on its own 2 legs, and it looked at her. It was the first human being. Nuwa was overjoyed. She made another, and another. Crouching by the riverbank, kneading mud into shape after shape, breathing life into each one, watching each new person stand and look around at the mountains and rivers and sky with wonder she recognized in herself. But mud figures, made one at a time by a goddess's own careful hands, take time. And Nuwa wanted the earth filled with people. She wanted laughter rising up from valleys. She wanted feet on every road her brother's veins had become. So, the legend says, she grew impatient with the slowness of crafting each person individually, and she took a length of rope or a vine, dipped it into the thick mud, and swung it through the air, flinging droplets of mud in every direction. Every droplet that landed became a person too. And here is where the story does something quietly devastating, something that has been told and retold for thousands of years as an explanation for inequality itself. The figures Nuwa shaped carefully, one at a time, with her full attention and her own hands, those became the wealthy, the noble, the fortunate. The droplets flung carelessly from the rope, formed quickly and without the same individual care, those became the poor, the common people, those who would struggle. It is not a flattering explanation. It is not meant to be comforting. But it is honest about something every civilization eventually has to reckon with, the uncomfortable suspicion that fortune is not always earned, that some people seem shaped with more care than others through no fault or virtue of their own, and that no civilization has ever fully escaped that ache. Nuwa, in this telling, is not cruel. She is tired, and overjoyed, and overwhelmed by how much love she has for these small mud creatures who keep looking up at her, and she does what most of us would do in the face of an impossible task and an aching desire to see it finished. She speeds up. And the speeding up has consequences that ripple forward into every generation that follows. The goddess who mended the sky. Nuwa's story does not end with the creation of humanity. There is a second half to her myth, one that reveals her not just as a creator, but as the one who saved her creation when the world itself nearly broke apart. The legend tells of a great catastrophe. In some versions, it followed a battle between 2 powerful spirits or elemental forces, the fire god Jurong and the water god Gonggong, who fought a war so violent that Gonggong, in his fury at losing, smashed his head against Mount Buzhou, one of the pillars believed to hold up the sky. The pillar cracked. The sky itself tore open. The 4 corners of the heavens collapsed unevenly, the earth split and cracked beneath the unbalanced weight, wildfires that could not be extinguished raged across the land, and floodwaters that would not recede poured up from below. The humans Nuwa had so carefully shaped from mud, and so carelessly flung from a rope, were dying together, drowning and burning in a broken world that Panga's body could no longer hold steady. Nuwa looked at what was happening to her children, and she acted. She gathered stones of 5 colors from the riverbeds, some say from the bed of a great river, smoothed by water over unknown ages, and she melted them down and used them to patch the broken sky, sealing the tear the way you might mend a torn roof, color matched to color, piece fitted to piece, until the hole above the world was closed. But the sky needed more than patching. It needed support. So Nuwa caught a giant tortoise. In some versions she killed it for this purpose, a detail the old texts do not soften, and she took its 4 legs and used them to prop up the 4 corners of the heavens where the original pillars had failed, giving the sky 4 sturdy new legs to stand on, the way a table needs all 4 legs even, or it will tip and spill everything resting on top of it. And finally, to stop the floods that were still rising, she gathered the ashes of burnt reeds and used them to dam the surging waters, holding back the deluge until the earth could dry and steady itself again. The texts say that after this, the sky was slightly tilted toward the northwest, which is why, even now, the stars appear to move in that direction across the night sky, a permanent, visible reminder etched into the heavens themselves that the world was once broken, and a goddess fixed it with her own hands, using stones and a tortoise's legs and the ashes of burnt reeds, because that was what she had available, and her children were drowning, and there was no time to wait for better materials. What these 2 stories are really about. I want you to notice something about both halves of this myth, because it is the same idea expressed twice, in two different registers. Pangu does not create the world through command. He does not speak it into existence from a comfortable distance. He splits it open with effort, holds it apart with his own straining body for 18,000 years, and then gives every remaining part of himself, his breath, his blood, his bones, his eyes, so that the separation he achieved could become permanent. His sacrifice is not symbolic. It is total. There is nothing of Pangu left over after the world is made, because he became the world, completely, without remainder. Nuwa does not create humanity from a distance either. She kneels in actual mud. She shapes figures with her actual fingers. And when the sky breaks and her children are dying, she does not send a storm or issue a decree from somewhere safe. She melts stones with her own hands. She takes the legs from a tortoise. She gathers ash. She gets dirty fixing the catastrophe, the same way she got dirty making the people in the first place. This is the consistent thread running through Chinese creation mythology that distinguishes it from so many others. Divinity here is not aloof. It is not a being who creates from outside the world and then withdraws to watch from somewhere untouched by what was made. Pangu's body is the mountains you can climb and the rivers you can drink from. Nuwa's hands are in the mud you stand on and the patched sky over your head. The sacred, in this tradition, is not separate from the material world. It is not hovering above it, watching. It has been poured entirely into the dirt, the stone, the water, the sky, used up, given away, spent completely on behalf of something it would never get to fully enjoy. Pangu never saw the mountains his limbs became. He never breathed the wind his breath turned into. He gave his entire existence for a world he would not get to live in. Nuwa, watching her sky-patching work hold against the weight of heaven, watching her children walk again on solid ground, she at least got to see the world she saved continue. But she too understood, by the end, that creation and maintenance are not separate acts. The world does not simply happen once and then run on its own forever after. It has to be tended. It breaks. Someone has to notice the tear in the sky and decide, with whatever materials are at hand, to fix it rather than let everyone drown. This is why these stories endured for thousands of years across an enormous civilization, told in villages and painted on temple walls and carved into stone reliefs that still exist today. They are not simply explanations for why mountains exist or why the stars drift northwest. They are a statement about what it costs to bring a world into being and what it costs to keep it standing. The answer, in both cases, is everything. Pangu gave everything once, completely, and never looked back. Nuwa gives repeatedly, first in patient handfuls of mud, then in a desperate scramble of colored stones and tortoise legs and burnt ash, because the work of caring for what you've made is never actually finished after the first attempt. There is something quietly instructive in that, even now, far outside the world of myth. The things that hold us up, the people who built what we depend on, the ones who showed up when something broke and used whatever was within reach to fix it rather than waiting for the perfect tool, they rarely get remembered the way they deserve. The sky does not thank Nuwa for tilting slightly so it could stay in place. The mountains do not remember that they were once a giant's arms. But the world still stands. The sky still holds. And somewhere underneath all of it, the actual cost of that standing and that holding is still there, woven into the ground itself, if you know enough of the old story to look for it. The oldest answer. So when you ask, as every civilization eventually asks, where did the world come from? China's oldest answer is not a single word spoken into a void. It is a giant who slept inside an egg for 18,000 years, who broke that egg and then stood between heaven and earth for 18,000 years more, refusing to rest until the gap was wide enough to hold on its own, and who then gave every part of his body so the separation would last. And when you ask where humanity came from, the answer is not a breath exhaled from somewhere distant and untouchable. It is a goddess kneeling at a riverbank, shaping mud with her own hands because the silence of an empty, beautiful world had become unbearable to her, and later, melting stones and stealing a tortoise's legs because the sky she loved had cracked open above the children she had made. Ancient stories. Eternal truth. This has been SERA Mythology.